Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this month's First Thursday Club. Our first time host today, so I'm very excited to introduce the topic. By the way, I'm Jim White. I'm a principal consultant for Nature Positive, one of the RSK companies. Today's topic is EU Deforestation Regulation, otherwise known as the abbreviation EUDR, and we're going to be discussing the implications for businesses and the pathways towards compliance. Our speaker today is my esteemed colleague, Molly Scott, who is a senior environmental consultant for Nature Positive, and I'll introduce her in a little bit more detail shortly. Before we get to the fun bit, I'm just going to have to give a few housekeeping notes. So all attendees, your webcams and microphones are automatically turned off. That doesn't mean that we don't want to hear from you though, so please post any questions you've got into the question box. At the end of the session, we've got a question and answer section, and we'll go through as many answers as we can. Anything we can't quite get time to cover today, we will respond to following the webinar. What you will also see, about an hour after the webinar finishes, you'll get a short survey. If you could please just take a few minutes to fill this out, massively helpful and greatly appreciated. Now, to introduce our speaker for today, as I said, Molly Scott is a senior environmental consultant for Nature Positive. She has substantial experience embedding sustainability into businesses, working across a range of sectors. These include food and beverage, agriculture, textile, manufacturing, and financial services. And she's got an intricate understanding of how nature-related risks and opportunities integrate into these very complex global supply chains. And this includes experience in understanding key upcoming legislations, determining client exposure and reporting requirements. And as you've probably guessed from today's topic, this also includes a particular focus on the EU Deforestation Regulation. Molly, thank you very much. I'll hand over to yourself.
Thank you so much, Jim, for that introduction. Just want to say hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to turn my camera off just for focus, but I will still be here. And yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. So just to kick off, I'm going to run through the agenda for today. I'm going to start with an overview of the EUDR and the common challenges that businesses are facing. Then I'll run through some practical steps that businesses can take to prepare, which will largely be based on my experience supporting clients on their journeys. And then we'll go through some specific case studies. So just before diving in, I do want to touch on the recent uncertainties around the EUDR. So since its adoption in 2023, there have been recent amendments, which have only been confirmed on Tuesday this week. I'm happy to say these seem to have been finalised. We are just waiting for the European Parliament and the Council, which will now formally have to adopt the amendment of the EUDR before it can come into effect. But I have updated the presentation with the latest information, so but do keep an eye out on any news from the Commission. So what is the EU Deforestation Regulation? So the EUDR bans the import and export of 7 key commodities if they are linked to deforestation or degradation. And by banning these commodities, it places responsibility on companies to ensure that their supply chains are free from deforestation, requiring due diligence to verify sourcing practices. And within each relevant commodity, the regulation defines which products are in scope according to a list of their EU customs codes. And these are provided in Annex 1 of the regulation. So one of the recent amendments that I spoke about extends the deadline to December 30th, 2025, giving businesses, and crucially the EU, extra time to comply. So from that date, large operators and traders must carry out due diligence on all relevant imports and exports. And just to note, SMEs will have until June 2026 for compliance. So who has to do what? And there are 2 defining types of businesses in scope, and these are operators and traders. Operators are defined as the first legal entity to introduce the product into the EU by directly importing or exporting it. Traders, on the other hand, are defined as the purchaser of finished product that is already circulating on the EU market and has been imported or placed by another entity. So they both are required to do due diligence, and the addition of the traders requirement adds an extra layer of responsibility, creating an additional checkpoint to really increase reliability that products are both deforestation free and legally produced. So we know who's in scope, but what are the conditions of the regulation? By December 30th, 2025, operators and traders will need to ensure three things. So firstly, products are deforestation free, and this means that they have not been produced on land that was deforested since the cutoff date of December 31st, 2020. Secondly, products must have been produced in accordance with relevant legislation, which includes all sorts, for example, land legislation, protected areas, legality of land tenure, labour rights, and other forms of legislation. And finally, both these requirements must be assured through a due diligence statement, which the operator or trader must submit to the EU register prior to import or export. And funnily enough, this register went live about 45 minutes ago. I received an email, so you can go check it out. And just a note on non-compliance. So non-compliance can result in market exclusion and fines of up to 4% of annual turnover. So non-compliance really does present a huge financial risk for businesses in scope. So what does due diligence really require? How can you comply with these conditions? Due diligence involves three main steps, which lead to a signed statement confirming negligible risk for commodity imports or exports. Firstly, there are clear information requirements which are outlined by Article 9 of the regulation, and these include commodity details and sourcing locations, including the geolocation coordinates or spatial data for the area of production. Secondly, risk assessments must be conducted to ensure that there is no or negligible risk found within these supply chains. And these must account for deforestation and legality risks. So must take into account presence of forests, presence of indigenous peoples, corruption, probability of contamination or mixing, and so on. And thirdly, if risks are identified, companies must conduct deeper assessments and mitigation measures. And these could be more information requests for suppliers, audits, site visits, that sort of thing. And once confirmed, a signed due diligence statement must be submitted outlining the commodity and geolocation information alongside a statement that declares no or negligible risk of non-compliance was found during the due diligence process. So the risk assessment and mitigation details must be available on request, with member states auditing a sample of shipments. So the level of due diligence an organisation needs to do will depend on the sourcing country. And the EU is currently devising a system that categorises countries based on different risk classifications, owing to historic deforestation, among other factors. And a decision in Parliament on Tuesday confirms, Tuesday this week, confirms that there are three country risk levels: high, standard, and low. For high and standard, full due diligence is required, including risk assessments and mitigation, if necessary. And the key difference is the extent of checks conducted by member states. For low risk, only simplified due diligence is required, although a statement is still needed. And I just wanted to take a moment to discuss the business case of this regulation. Of course, there is a clear financial business case of avoiding penalties of non-compliance. Especially during the recent uncertainty around this regulation, companies may well be caught off guard and unprepared. This also presents an opportunity to get ahead of the competition. If your business can get organised and prepare sufficiently, you might find that competition have caught unprepared. Considering market exclusion is a very possible penalty, you could find shortages from suppliers, allows you to increase your market reach. From another perspective, nature strategies and reporting are becoming more and more prominent, both due to the links with climate goals, but also due to the increasing frameworks and methodologies available for companies to understand their interactions with nature. The EUDR, in its simplest form, aims to eliminate deforestation across commodities with historic responsibility for deforestation. So, by implementing EUDR processes, companies can further their nature goals. For example, collecting geolocation data can support geospatial analysis, enabling double materiality assessments to understand impacts and dependencies on nature. And this goes beyond just deforestation impacts. And this sort of process is key to frameworks such as the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. The EUDR also aligns with frameworks such as the Science-Based Targets Network, which includes the 7 EUDR commodities in its high impact commodities list. And inclusion in this list requires companies to address them in their nature target setting process. So data from EUDR compliance and supplier engagement can really aid this process. Just overall, since so much of our impact on both nature and climate does lie within our supply chains, positive change requires engaging suppliers. So mapping those supply chains and sharing that data can support broader sustainability efforts beyond just preventing deforestation. Okay, so we've talked about the what, now we're going to look into the how. There are 3 key systems and processes that are needed for compliance, and these are policy, traceability, and risk management. And the key to all of these areas is to assess current capabilities and processes and identify the gaps towards compliance. So the table shown here is based on my experience with clients and the results of readiness assessments that we have undertaken. So firstly, policy. Information collection is crucial. Communicating our requirements to suppliers is key. You'll have supplier codes of conduct, likely deforestation policies, maybe even separate commodity sourcing policies. Updating these documents to align with EUDR requirements, such as those information requests, is a key step towards compliance. And crucially, communicating these new policies to suppliers with sufficient time for them to prepare is crucial. Secondly, traceability. So many clients that we speak to only have visibility to Tier 1 and Tier 2 of their supply chains, and that's fairly common. EUDR requires traceability to production plots of land, those geolocation coordinates. So supplier engagement is going to be necessary to gather those details of those lower tiered suppliers. Certifications can be used to collect information on sourcing, but you must go beyond them. Traceability is, of course, complex, and it is likely that external digital support is needed to collect and store that traceability data. And then finally, risk management. Your company will be signing due diligence statements saying that you have found no or negligible risk within your supply chain. So your risk management system is therefore crucial to get right, and it needs to be adaptable. You will have grievance mechanisms in place, or maybe risk management strategies for specific risks, such as modern slavery. Building on these by integrating additional risk data aligned to EUDR is a great next step. So I've tried to break down kind of steps towards compliance into 5 key steps. So the first one here is understand your exposure. Look at your supply chain, map those commodities that you use against those in scope, and then identify specific supply chains and Tier 1 suppliers that will be under obligations. You've got to define your responsibilities, so are you an operator or a trader? Secondly, it's really crucial to get senior leadership buy-in early. Compliance takes investment. Now you know that you're in scope, define the business case by presenting the risks and those opportunities to senior leaders to really justify the resource that you need. Thirdly, you now know that you need to comply, but now you have to work out the strategy towards compliance. So the first step is to perform the gap analysis as demonstrated in the previous slide. This is the how are you going to fill the gaps? Will you need internal or external support? Internal training will be a key part of preparing for this regulation, as it's interdepartmental. So procurement managers will need to understand new policies, finance teams, legal teams will need to understand exposure. Creating an EUDR specific training for colleagues and supporting resources is a great way to ensure your business is aware and prepared. And then finally, you may need to seek external support. Digital systems are going to be crucial. Traceability, supplier engagement, even risk assessments will need some sort of digital process, but also experts can support you through all of these. And then step 4, so the data that you need and the deforestation risk is within your supply chains. So supplier engagement is probably the most crucial step to get right. In my experience, engaging suppliers early is crucial. Letters of intent, clear policy requirements, and clear non-compliance procedures are a great start, but engagement does have to be continuous. I've previously worked with a large retailer in their EUDR preparation, and we hosted webinars and how-to sessions to support suppliers to really understand what was being asked of them, whilst also giving them the opportunity to ask questions. Additionally, resources were provided to suppliers for reference. Clear data requirements is also key, and these need to be easy to fill out and submit to support that engagement. Spreadsheets or Google Sheets are really useful, but do make sure you give guidance on how to fill them out so that the data you receive will be in the correct format and of the best quality. And then step 5, finally, do give yourself time to pilot these new systems. You need time to stress test them, try and break them over the next year. Set internal deadlines and supply deadlines that are well before the end of 2025. Parliament has given us another year, so let's use it. Okay, so I'm sure from the previous content you have noticed some of the key challenges already. I'm going to run through 4 of these in the next section and just discuss some of the ways that you could mitigate these. So the overarching challenges, these are based on conversations I've been having with clients, both during EUDR preparation, but they're also common challenges that clients can face in general. So the first one specific to EUDR is that EUDR does not allow for legal deforestation. So it goes against a lot of country level legislation. And this also means it goes beyond the UK timber regulation. We've spoken about traceability, a very common challenge for all industries. And the challenge here is not only going beyond tier 1, but getting those geolocation coordinates. Thirdly, resources and data availability speak for themselves. How can an organization define the business case to enable that resource allocation, and how do you deal with the extra data requirements? And then finally, smallholder inclusion. There has been a lot of criticism around the EUDR and its potential to exclude smallholders. So it's really crucial organizations implement strategies to avoid this. One of the reasons for the EUDR delay was because companies and countries were not prepared enough to reduce this risk. So it's definitely going to be a big focus over the next year. Okay, so now we've run through the key challenge, I'm going to run through each one and provide some advice for mitigations. So, legal deforestation. To assess this risk, you first have to identify where it is by assessing the deforestation legislation within each country that you source from. Within those countries that do allow legal deforestation, you will need to perform extra due diligence. And this will include assessing whether forest areas overlap with your sourcing areas or if they are close enough to present a risk of potential deforestation. And this is not just a snapshot risk assessment. It needs to be an ongoing assessment because deforestation risk could occur at any time. So your management system needs to be adaptable. Ultimately, if you can't be certain of no or negligible risk, it may be a case of moving away from these suppliers. Traceability is the biggest challenge, especially looking at market characteristics such as mass balance certifications and that prevalence of smallholders. I'm sure we could do multiple workshops just on supply chain traceability, but I'm just going to touch on some of the key points. So once you've identified your supply chains in scope, you need to collate all of your tier 1 suppliers and their contact details. You should have these for financial and tax purposes, and you should be able to assign sourcing volumes to each supplier. My advice is to start with a letter of intent to each of these suppliers with clear timelines and expectations. Create data forms that clearly outline the data you are looking for, with guidance for how to fill it out. And these will include sourcing and traceability information, clarifying questions about what evidence they have, and to what extent they've already assessed deforestation risk. In my experience, it's best to hold a workshop or call with suppliers where you can run through the information requests and they have an opportunity to ask any questions. Again, it's all about setting clear deadlines for your suppliers, which are well before 30th of December 2025. And procurement managers are your enablers here, so train them on what they need to ask from suppliers. Make sure they understand the urgency. Certifications can be utilised, especially those with clear chain of custody, but you must go beyond and collect that geolocation data. And finally, it's common to seek external support through digital tools to understand how they can support both collecting data and using it to produce due diligence statements. So resources and data availability are definitely a key issue. The potential financial impact of non-compliance is significant, and the upfront investment in the required data systems is much smaller in comparison to the fines you could face. Communicating this business case is key to justifying that resource that you need. Data is central to the risk assessment requirements outlined by the regulation, which calls for information on deforestation risks, social practices, governance standards, and supply chain transparency. Identify the data that you need to evaluate these risks and then determine appropriate data types and sources. If there are gaps in internal capabilities, external sources such as those digital systems or consultants can fill these needs. And ultimately, this investment will enable you to meet regulatory requirements, reduce that risk of penalties, and ensure long-term compliance, making it a sound financial decision for the business. So for smallholders, I'm going to go into a bit more detail, as not only is there a large risk to them of exclusion for the supply chain, but there's also a risk to organizations as the information requirements will be hard to meet for supply chains that are largely dependent on smallholders. If a smallholder's product cannot be assured as being no or negligible risk, it won't be able to enter the market, and this could cause huge disruptions to businesses through lack of available supply. Some of the key challenges facing smallholder inclusion, and let's be clear, the onus should not be on the smallholders to overcome these, could be lack of awareness of the regulation, the cost associated with its compliance, the potential limited power they might have to make decisions to ensure compliance. Maybe they have a lack of technology to provide geolocation data, for example. Additionally, smallholder land tenures may not be legal enough to meet the EUDR requirements. They might have unofficial land agreements or won't own the land, which could cause conflict between smallholders and EUDR compliance. So to support smallholders, you have to know where they are, and you can find this information by engaging lower tiered suppliers, looking at regional level data, where are the smallholders likely to be? Engage those mills, where do they source from? They're on the ground. And then finally, looking for smallholder cooperatives in the area and engaging them. And once you know where they are, what is it you can do? So interestingly, there are some really cool initiatives at the government level to support smallholders with this regulation. For example, in Côte d'Ivoire, they're implementing a national cocoa traceability system where farmers are issued ID cards that link them to an e-payment system. And this allows farmers a fair price as it lowers the risks of corruption by middlemen, but also provides that traceability needed for operators. The onus is now on the EU to support these systems. And so with an extra year, we're really hoping that they will. From a business perspective, smallholders are likely to need a bit more direct engagement and investment than larger suppliers. Cooperatives are a great place to start for the investment. An investment can be in the forms of buying direct, providing training on the requirements of the EUDR, providing the technologies that they need, and then also training on sustainable farming practices. And I'll go through an example of this later. Additionally, some certifications are also supporting smallholder inclusion through smallholder credits, which is an indirect way to invest with smallholders. Okay, so now we're going to finish with some real-world case studies, and I've picked two of these. One of them is around a business's preparations, and the other is specific to that smallholder inclusion challenge. Okay, so this is the global manufacturer, and they started by performing an exposure analysis and identified that they have a few products in scope. They have listed their tier 1 suppliers for these commodities alongside the sourcing volumes and sourcing countries and contact information. The policy, they have updated their policies to align with EUDR requirements. From that gap analysis, they found that they currently only have visibility to tier 1 suppliers and country level sourcing data. So they are now looking for a traceability digital provider to support that functionality, but also to support the supplier data collection and storage and production of due diligence statements. They've engaged suppliers early with a letter of intent and have now sent them a supplier data request form in Excel format, which covers how traceable their supply chain already is, alongside risk information, including existing risks or mitigations. They have created a risk assessment process in Excel that includes all risks disclosed by EUDR that they can fill out per location. And this will include specific data, supplier data, but also data from global data sets. Importantly, they have started stress testing these processes to identify any gaps. One gap of which that they have identified is that supplier engagement. They are really struggling to maintain that engagement, so they are now seeking external support. And the next steps include adapting their supplier engagement process to strengthen it, implement that digital traceability system, and continuing to stress test the risk assessment process. And now we're going to look at palm oil in Indonesia. So this is a really great story about how to include smallholders. So a global operator has been sourcing palm oil from an area in Indonesia for years. And usually they source from a mill where they buy mass balance palm. And West Kalimantan is 100% RSPO certified, which very closely aligns with the EUDR. But there is some extra evidence needed for due diligence, which includes geolocations. And the operator also requires that products are not mixed or with non-compliant bunches like they could be in mass balance supply chains. So this operator has decided, therefore, to directly invest with these smallholders through a cooperative. So they now buy directly from the farms, which allows them to maintain traceability to mill, in which they house their palm product in separate silos. So this allows them to directly trace the palm they purchase back to that geolocation point and demonstrates the no or negligible risk needed. This is great for the operator, who can now sell this palm oil in the EU, but it's also great for the smallholders, who will now get a fairer price as the middleman has been cut out. Additionally, the operator is now investing in sustainable agricultural practice training, which can help the smallholders increase their yields whilst reducing environmental impacts. And this is a really innovative way of reducing the risk of deforestation as well, which is commonly the result of agricultural expansion due to the need for increased yields and income. Okay, so I'm just going to sum up the presentation with a few key takeaways. So firstly, the business case and opportunity. It's crucial to define and communicate the business case. Companies that I've spoken to are finding it hard to make the business case to senior leadership, but it really lies in reducing that financial risk. Fines of up to 4% annual turnover can be devastating. But compliance also helps to meet any existing deforestation targets that are really common amongst these industries. Additionally, I spoke about the opportunity this legislation could pose. If you can get organised ahead of your competition, there could be instances of supply chain disruption in your industry, leaving competitors' markets open. Secondly, there is an extra year for preparation. So if you start now and make time to test your processes and get it right, you will be in a great place for the 30th of December 2025. And then finally, integration with nature strategy. So science-based targets for nature, corporate sustainability reporting directive, task force for nature-related financial disclosures, all of the acronyms, all of these are working towards the same goal, and efforts towards the EUDR not only complement these, but can help increase an organization's nature influence. So I just want to say thanks so much for joining and listening in. My contact details are here on the screen alongside my face, in case you forgot what I look like. But if you'd like to follow up on anything, please do, either anything that we've discussed or any acronyms I've spoken about. And I believe we have time for some questions.
We do indeed. Thank you very much, Molly. Really, really useful summary of quite a complex piece of legislation. I think, yeah, the risk profile to it, both financial risk profile but also opportunity profile, is quite substantial. You know, access to one of the biggest markets in the world, essentially. We've got quite a few questions. I'll start to go through them. Any audience members, please feel free to ask any more as we run through. I'm going to start with one topic which has come up a couple of times. So this is about really the relationship with this being an EU directive, and a lot of the audience are clearly based in the UK, and that kind of relationship. So yeah, could you speak a little bit around how that interface might work in practice?
Yeah, sure. So we know that supply chains are global. So even if you are based in the UK, some of your supply chains are likely to run through the EU. So your suppliers might be in scope. Additionally, there's a lot of talk around the UK following this regulation. It won't be for a couple of years, but it's definitely on the horizon. And speaking about the business case and that alignment with the nature strategies, it's great to get ahead and implement these processes, so that even though you don't need to be compliant right now, you have those practices in place.
Brilliant, thanks, Molly. Right, so the next question I've got is around the kind of risk profile and traceability. So 7 key commodities in this legislation. Is there variation in the risk profile of those different commodities, or should we really consider them all equally?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So the financial risk is effectively the same for each of the commodities, but I guess the risk of non-compliance does vary. So if we think about the 7 commodities, one of the higher risk ones would likely be cattle, because you need to provide the geolocations for each place it's been throughout its life cycle. So it's just a very complex supply chain. Additionally, for cattle, there doesn't exist certifications like RSPO or FSC that can be used for that risk mitigation. So I think cattle would probably be one of the hardest. But in terms of what could present that risk, I think traceability is probably one of the biggest risks. So the more complex supply chain, the more risk. Again, I guess it also depends on where you're sourcing it from. So if you look at cattle again, in the EU, there's legislation that requires cattle to have passports, so you can trace it back to where it's been throughout its life cycle. But for example, in Brazil, indirect suppliers are really hard to trace. But then if you look at it from another perspective, with cattle, if you think about how it's getting imported or exported, it's likely to be segregated. If you think of slab of beef, that's going to be in plastic packaging. You can segregate those that are compliant and those that aren't, and it's very unlikely that they're going to be mixed. But if you look at other commodities, let's think soy, palm, they're not segregated, and the industry probably doesn't have as much infrastructure to allow that segregation. So it would be a huge challenge, a bigger challenge for them to maintain that traceability and that confidence that you're tracing, that you've got that traceability in place. But yeah, there's definitely, ultimately, the financial risk is the same, but the likelihood of non-compliance does vary throughout commodities. But yeah, great question.
Interesting. Yes, it's both. Yeah, some degree of difference between commodities, but also that regional difference is probably the key, and I suppose hence the kind of country risk ratings as well. Another question, a bit more practical. So the organisation this individual works for buys commodities that are in scope, so in the 7, but then they use those commodities to create products that are out of scope. Do you have any advice in terms of what the due diligence expectations would be for that organisation?
Yeah, so it depends if they are the first to place it on the market, if they're the first to import it. So if they are, and they import a version of that commodity that's in scope, they will have to do full due diligence. But if they are only buying that commodity once it's been changed into something that's out of scope, they won't have to. So it's hard to give an exact answer without the details, but effectively it's a case of really looking at the way that you operate, whether you're an operator or a trader, and what those harmonized codes are across that across those operations. So I think it's really good to get your legal team involved in this, just to double check that you are correct in exactly what you have to do. But yeah, it's cross-checking those harmonized codes with what you're buying and your trade data, and really pinpointing exactly which supply chains you are in scope for.
Awesome. Excuse me. The next question I've got is around certification. So obviously a lot of the products, the commodities, sorry, the 7 key commodities have certification bodies, but recognizing, as you've said, that a number of them fall below EUDR requirements. Are you aware of the work that those bodies are doing? Are they trying to kind of uplift their certification to become closer? And do you have any indication on I imagine it'd be quite a long process, but yeah, any thoughts or updates on that?
Yeah, certification is really interesting because the EU have directly said that you can't rely on certifications, and a lot of that is due to, first of all, the lack of that traceability granularity. So a lot of them will have chain of custody, but they won't have those geolocation coordinates requirements. But also, some certifications, their definition of deforestation misaligns with the EUDR, which creates an extra level of challenge. So some will, deforestation and degradation just won't mean the same thing, and they might have other dates that align with their certifications. But from my perspective, a lot of regulations are now seeing the opportunity to align further to the EUDR. So let me think of an example. So FSC, which is the Forest Stewardship Council, they're widely used and widely respected as well. It's a certification for forests and for forest products, and they have released a regulatory module which gives the certificate holders the opportunity to extend their scope to align with EUDR. If I'm thinking of another one, so palm oil, the RSPO, very closely aligned with EUDR. One of their issues is that that definition difference and that extra information that is needed. But they've created a voluntary system where producers can add EUDR compliant information, which buyers can then use. So they're kind of supporting them, but not making it compulsory, sort of thing. And then additionally, I mentioned it briefly earlier, and I guess it's not necessarily a certification scheme, but that country level traceability. So in countries where there are a lot of smallholders and they understand that there's a big risk of exclusion, which could really impact their local economies, they're creating those national traceability systems that provide farmers with traceability and yeah, opportunities to market. So although it's not necessarily an existing certification, it's kind of another type of certification that's come to fruition due to the requirements of the EUDR. So yeah, there's a lot of change going on, and there's a lot of certifications that are now trying to align or complement the EUDR much more.
Interesting. So I've got a couple more questions here. We have got quite a bit more time. So obviously anyone on the call who does want to pose any questions, please do. Just on the topic of countries and the risk rating of countries, this question asks, how often do you think the risk rating for countries will be updated? I suppose to preface that question, do we have the first risk ratings? Yeah, we do.
No,
okay.
Yes. No, sorry, we don't. I was nodding at the
question.
We don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, I suppose yeah. What is your current understanding of that process? And I don't know if there's been any guide. I suppose if we don't have the original risk rating, we probably don't have guidance on how often that will be updated. But any context you can bring on that?
Yeah, sure. So no, we don't have the risk ratings yet. Parliament on Tuesday just recently scrapped a proposed amendment to add a fourth no risk rating. So there's been a lot of uncertainty around this country risk rating, but we know now that it will be high, standard and low. So the EU will have to release these 6 months prior to implementation. So we are expecting those country risk ratings as of June 2025. My advice is just treat every country as standard, so full due diligence. But I think the EU, one of the requirements of the EU DR is that they will reevaluate it in 2028, and that will include looking at those country risk ratings and seeing if they still align, seeing if they still, if any of them need to change, that sort of thing. So there is scope for them to change, but not until 2028. But in 2028, there could be a whole host of change to the regulation. So yeah, for now, I treat everything as standard. It's not obvious, but it's fairly self-explanatory if you look at different countries, which will be standard and high compared to low, because it's all based on deforestation, historic data, and legality and governance systems throughout each country, that sort of thing. So you can kind of have a pretty good guess.
Awesome. And then question is just coming at you around the potential scope of change. Has there been any guidance whether I imagine it might be a similar timeline really, but guidance around the 7 commodities and potential scope for those to change or increase or amend in the future?
Yep, there absolutely is. So the list of harmonized codes, or the list of products for each commodity in scope, is subject to change in 2028. So that could change. There could also be additional commodities added to the list. So I think there's been talk of tea, sugar, rice. They might come into scope in future as well. So yeah, something to keep an eye out for, definitely.
Awesome. Brilliant. Got another couple in here. This is more a practical question. Do you have any kind of specific examples of the type of information that you might find in a data request to a supplier, around EUDR regulations?
Yeah, sure. So typically you want to ask them for the information that's going to be needed for that due diligence statement. So the information about the commodity, which includes scientific name, the amount, the harmonized code, that sort of thing. But also you want to ask them about their current state of their supply chains. So what information they already have, what level of traceability have they got to already, so that you can identify what needs to be done. But you also want to ask about their risk assessment processes and risk mitigation. So are they reliant on certification? Are they implementing any other sort of risk mitigations? Ultimately, you want to ask them for information that's going to support your risk assessment process and support you being able to provide the correct information for due diligence. So, for example, you'd be asking, do you have traceability to plot of production for any or all volume sourced? If not, what steps are you using to gather this information? what percentage of volume is covered by certifications, but you also want to look at which types of certifications they're using, because some differ in how much they align to the EUDR. And then risks, kind of what risks are present within your supply chain, or are there certain areas where you see higher risks, and what exactly are you doing to mitigate these risks? Those sorts of questions. But you want to provide clear guidance as well for how to fill this information out so that it can be useful for you and in the right format.
I think that speaks to the, as you said in the presentation, the overlap and the integration of nature-focused assessments, right? Location is so important if we want to understand these kind of impacts and risk profiles. So I think what you're saying there resonates a lot with a lot of the work we do looking at nature-based assessments. Speaking of nature, I've got a question a bit more specifically around habitat, well, around forests. So the question is, do you know within the EUDR what the definition for a forest is? For example, is there like a percentage of tree cover that would indicate something being a forest over a shrubland or something else, I suppose? And then it goes on to say, has there been any discussion about extending the regulation to any ecosystems other than forests that may be impacted through, yeah, obviously the quantities in question?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a definition of forest that they use. Again, it doesn't align with all other forest definitions, so it doesn't align with the FAO one either, which is quite annoying. But yeah, it's effectively about 3% cover, and then there's also that degradation, because timber supply, you cut down trees for timber, so that doesn't really count as deforestation. There's very specific forest degradation rules for that. And kind of degradation or land change that comes under the regulation. And then, wait, what was the second part of your question?
Oh, I've just removed it. Sorry, I think it was around whether you're expecting other habitat types to be included in similar or future legislation. So rather than just focus on deforestation, whether degradation or removal of savannas and wetlands and all the other kind of wonderful habitats we've got globally.
Exactly. Yes, there is. That is another part of the reevaluation in 2028. They are going to consider other ecosystems, especially, because forests are important, but so are wetlands, so are peatlands. So yeah, absolutely, that's something that's going to be considered in future. So it's good to get your allocations now.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Molly. Right, we've got one more question, which I think rounds it up quite perfectly with time as well. So this again probably speaks to that integration of maybe other assessments that clients might be going through. So does climate change or climate risk play any part in the risk assessments, or will it impact supplier disclosures in the future?
Gosh, end on a hard one. Does climate risk play a part in the risk of deforestation? Sorry, could you repeat it again?
So does climate change or climate risk play a part in the risk assessment process, or will it impact supplier disclosures in the future? So I suppose it's whether within the due diligence process that we currently believe that climate risk will be part of that disclosure, or whether that's maybe a future thing. It's a vital thing to be considering within the supply chain, because I imagine these areas are going to, whether it's water risk, flood and storm risk, all these things are going to impact these supply chains. So it's a good thing to be doing. But yeah, are you aware of it currently being part of any of the specific requirements in EUDR?
No, there's no requirement to kind of report on the climate risk associated, and I guess there's an indirect link to climate risk in terms of deforestation, because obviously it can cause and it can impact on the climate regulation ecosystem service. So, but there's no specific direct requirement of climate risk reporting. But like we said, EUDR data and EUDR processes can support in understanding those climate risks and impacts. So yeah, always aligned.
Absolutely. Brilliant. So that was our last question, and that has pretty much timed everything perfectly. So I'd just like to say another huge thank you to yourself, Molly, for going through everything today. I'd also like to thank all of our attendees for joining. Just a reminder, please fill out the feedback survey you'll receive in about an hour's time. is much appreciated, and it only take you a couple of minutes to do so. And then just to let everyone know, we're going to take a short break on the First Thursday Club series. So there'll be no First Thursday Club in January. The next one will be in the first week of February. And details of this will be released on the RSK website shortly. Now we are in December. I suppose it's maybe a little bit too early to say, but as soon as we're not seeing you until February, I'll wish everyone a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jim, and thanks so much everyone for joining.